at a Literary Princess, and today I have my George Eliot project video on The Mill on the Floss. So we are finally getting back to the George Eliot project. Yes, this was supposed to be the book for like April. Yes, it's August. I don't know why it took me so long to read this book. Especially since this has historically been my favorite George Eliot book, but it took me forever this time. I think it is possibly because I had just reread it last year and I was like, I don't want to read it again. So I guess I should have thought about things a little bit more before starting the George Eliot project, but oh well. So The Mill on the Floss is George Eliot's second novel, published in 1860, and it follows really the two siblings, Maggie and Tom Tulliver. They live in a small village on their father's mill, and Maggie is the younger sister, Tom is the older brother, and we really follow them from childhood until kind of early adulthood. And the difficulties that they go through as their father loses the mill, Maggie's romantic relationships that always turn out poorly, and Tom. I hate Tom, but we'll talk about that. Tom kind of saving the family fortunes. So, what is the plot? The plot is loose. Again, as with Adam Beat, this really isn't a book about plot. This is a book about the characters, mostly Maggie. Unfortunately, sometimes we stray too far from Maggie, and that is when I tend to have difficulty with it, but we'll talk about that after. Maggie is a very energetic, bright young girl when we meet her, who loves books, who wants to learn things, but she's always kind of a mess. She doesn't conform to the proper Victorian little girl who will sit and help her mother, and so she wants to be out doing stuff or reading and learning. And unfortunately, in the early 19th century, she didn't have a lot of opportunities to do that. So while Tom gets sent to a tutor to learn Latin and mathematics, Maggie just has to stay at home. And it's unfair because Tom doesn't like school. He doesn't like learning. He isn't getting anything out of it, whereas Maggie absolutely would. So Tom has a boy that he met at school, Philip Wakeham, who is the son of their father's arch nemesis. And Maggie becomes friends with Philip. And after the family loses the mill, they don't see each other for a while, and they reconnect when they're slightly older. And Philip is in love with Maggie, and Maggie starts to fall in love with Philip, mainly because he is able to give her access to books and learning and intellectual conversation, whereas at home in their degraded state, Maggie doesn't really get much of anything. She has very few books. She actually tries to kind of give up her ambitions of learning because she thinks it'll make her happier. Since she can't have that, she'll just give it up and focus on being a good daughter to her mother. But this relationship with Philip rekindles that. Tom finds out and is mad and makes her give up Philip. And then we have another time jump, and we move to Maggie going to stay with her cousin Lucy, whose family is quite a bit more well off. Lucy has this suitor who's hanging around, Stephen Guest, and Stephen Guest starts to become interested in Maggie, and Maggie theoretically is interested in him, although we'll talk about that. Philip also comes back into the program here. He is a friend of Stephen and Lucy's, so Maggie is once again interacting with Philip, and Maggie finds herself caught between feelings for Stephen, her declaration of love for Philip, and her, feelings of friendship and family for Lucy, because Lucy is practically engaged to this guy, although not formally engaged to this guy. And again, we have another fallen woman situation here, as we did in Adam Bede. Maggie and Stephen go off on what is supposed to be a short boat ride, and he basically kidnaps her, okay? We'll talk about him too. And he's like, let's run away and get married. And she ultimately is like, no, I can't do that to Lucy. I can't do that to Philip. Like, that's morally wrong. And she goes back home without marrying him, and she becomes an outcast. She is estranged from Tom, who refuses to take her into his house. And she has a very difficult time. However, when crisis strikes and the river begins to flood, she goes immediately to save Tom in a boat. And unfortunately, the two of them drown. And that's the end of the book. Fun, huh? Real fun. So, I think that's the basic plot and character summary. We will move into my thoughts. So as I said, this has historically been my favorite George Eliot book, but I've read it 3 times now. This was the 3rd time. But every time I've read it, the rating gets lower and lower. So when I first read this at 14, it was a 5-star read. I adored it. And then when I reread it last year, it was a 4.5. I still really liked it, but I was like, there's some problems. And now this time, it's become a 4-star read for me, because I feel like I was even more aware of the problems. It's very slow. I would say about half of the book covers just basically Maggie's childhood antics, and it really could have been trimmed down so that we could have spent more time with her as a young adult and developing these romantic relationships. Because what I found is that I do not buy at all that Maggie was interested in Stephen Guest. Like, I just did not buy it at all. Her love story with Philip is so much more convincing. And with Stephen, it's like they kind of banter occasionally, and that's it. So I just didn't believe that she had these feelings for Stephen. Like, there is no evidence of it, really, at all, that I could see. So to have that kind of come out of nowhere it was like, no. It just didn't work for me at all. I also don't like Stephen as a character, which feels awkward to say because Stephen is the name of my husband. But, God, he's a dick. This book has 2 of my least favorite characters in literature in it. Stephen Guest, who's like a new addition to the list. I didn't realize how much I did not like him until this read around. But Tom Tolliver I've hated since I was 14. I hate him so much. I don't think you're supposed to hate him quite as much as I do, but he is such a self-righteous little dick. Ugh, I despise him. He's so mean to Maggie, most of the time for no reason. And I'm actually gonna, for Victober, do a video on my least favorite characters in Victorian literature, so I don't want to rant too much here because both of these guys will definitely be there. This does have a lot of really interesting themes. So of course there is this idea of what's a girl supposed to do in life? She has no education. She can't really work in most situations. She does become a governess for a little while, but her family is kind of ashamed of that and doesn't want her to go back to working, even though she feels like she should, so that she can earn her way in the world instead of just living off of others. And so we really have this idea of like girls should have more in society. They should be able to become educated, that education is important and good so that they can grow as people. We also have a lot of themes about morality and what is moral versus what society expects. Because if Maggie had married Stephen when they went off in the boat, like society would have judged them a bit, quite a bit. However, society would have gotten over it and everything would have been fine eventually. But she doesn't marry him. She comes home unmarried, and for that she is just completely cast out. So Maggie does what she thinks is morally right, which is to not marry Stephen because this is my cousin and best friend's basically fiance. There's no official engagement, but it's pretty understood. And also, I consider myself also engaged to Philip. So it is morally wrong to run off with Stephen in Maggie's eyes because of the hurt that it causes Philip and Lucy. However, society would view it as the right thing to do to have married him, and it's the wrong thing to do to come back unmarried. Society doesn't take into account that it would have hurt Lucy or Philip. They're only thinking of what societal conventions are, which is that a young woman can't run off with a man and then come back unmarried. So that is a big theme, especially in the latter part of the book. There's also lots of themes of social class. We see this especially with Maggie and Tom's aunts. So their mother has 3 sisters who are very frequently in here, and they are characters, but they all kind of have these different little slight differences in social class based on who they married and how much money they have. And it is very fascinating to look at. And especially when Maggie and Tom's family loses their mill, they are very degraded in social class, whereas Lucy's family is quite high in social class, but not quite as high as Stephen Guest's family. And Stephen's sisters are kind of skeptical of him marrying Lucy. So lots of interesting discussion of class. There is also this theme of like brunettes versus blondes, basically, that Maggie points out is in literature, and it comes into play here. Maggie has this very dark, very thick, very untamable hair that her mother just despairs over. Lucy is this blonde little perfect angel whose hair curls so perfectly. So this is a theme that I've been noticing in literature, Victorian literature specifically. Like there's the brunette girl and there's the blonde girl. And Maggie gives this really passionate speech about it after reading Corinne, which Philip lends to her. She says, "I didn't finish the book. As soon as I came to the blonde-haired young lady reading in the park, I shut it up and determined to read no further. I foresaw that the light-complexioned girl would win away all the love from Corinne and make her miserable. I am determined to read no more books where the blonde-haired women carry away all the happiness. I should begin to have a prejudice against them. If you could give me some story now where the dark woman triumphs, it would restore the balance. I want to avenge Rebecca and Flora MacIver and Nina and all the rest of the dark unhappy ones. Since you are my tutor, you ought to preserve my mind from prejudices. You are always arguing against prejudices." I would say that she already has a bit of a prejudice formed there. So, as a girl with dark hair, it seems like she wants to triumph and get happiness. And this is actually, I think, where my biggest problem with the book came this time around, is the tragic ending. Now, I've had my issues with the ending. The previous 2 times that I've read it. It does seem to kind of come out of nowhere, and like it's a flood of biblical proportions, and it's like, okay, that's a little convenient, George Eliot. But like I've been fine with it. Like I can get over it. This time around, I found it so disappointing that George Eliot could find nothing else to do with her dark-haired heroine than kill her off. So disappointing. And I think that really is what lowered the star rating for me, is that I'm like, you have this whole speech about how she wants to avenge the dark-haired heroines, and she could have had happiness here. And to have this whole outcast plot and then death after the Stephen Guest thing is particularly insulting, because I feel that her feelings for Stephen were so unconvincing. So for it to end like this was just so disappointing to me. And like, I still love Maggie Tulliver as a character, and that's why this is 4 stars and not 3 stars, because I do love Maggie Tulliver as a character. I think she's fantastic. And I mean, Tom's a great character too. I hate him. I don't know if I'm supposed to hate him. Tell me down in the comments. Am I supposed to hate Tom as much as I hate Tom? I feel like I'm not. However, the ending of this book truly is a disappointment. And it's taken me 3 reads to see how disappointing it really is. So, that is my thoughts on The Mill on the Floss. Let me know down in the comments below, have you read it? What do you think? Next month, we will be doing Silas Marner. It has been great chatting with you. I will see you soon. Bye.